Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Architecturally Speaking. I'm your host, Ryan Schwartz, and today we're continuing our three-part series focused on the Ontario Association of Architects Shift Challenge. The Shift Challenge is a design competition held every 2 years where the OAA picks a particular topic to explore and then invites architects who are registered with the OAA to submit a conceptual design project related to that topic. So the theme selected for 2025 was called Reshaping Communities. So the challenge this year was coming up with an architectural solution that starts to rethink our communities and how they're designed, how we can respond to the modern challenges that our cities are facing. So basically, how can we make our neighborhoods and our communities better? A jury then reviews the submissions, they pick a handful of winners, and we just so happen to have two of those winning architects with us today to discuss their projects. So we have David Peterson of David Peterson Architect with his team's project called Swansea Park, a development concept for the former Swansea Mews in Toronto. Welcome, David.
Welcome. Thank you.
And we also have Luke Johnson of Lloyd London Architects with his team's project Parkdale Commons, a living food bank. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks, Ryan.
So before we get into the specifics of your projects, the challenge this year was called Reshaping Communities. That's a pretty broad topic. So what first comes to mind when you were sort of dealing with this challenge and starting to think about this project in terms of reshaping communities? Who wants to dive in first?
Luke, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, it's a tough thing when you start to think about reshaping communities, especially from an architectural perspective, where what can you do? What are the things and the people and the topics that you can reach? It becomes quite broad. It becomes quite challenging. So for our project, we were lucky enough to have a conduit to the Parkdale community. Both my partner and I had lived in the Parkdale community, so we had a sense of kind of the needs and the deficiencies. But working with the Parkdale Food Bank, they are in touch with that community every day. So we were able to tap into kind of a direct pipeline of things. And ultimately, we had to just pick and choose what things we wanted to address in the competition. Even though it's an unbuilt, dreamt competition, you still have to focus that lens to come up with something that makes sense. So we had a tough time narrowing it down, but yeah.
How about you, David? What came to mind when thinking about reshaping communities?
For me, it was already a project that was happening inside our community. So it was a project we knew was going to happen, and we really felt that there needed to be an alternative. So we really wanted a counterpoint to what we knew would be proposed. From our point of view, we really wanted to have the project grow out of our analysis of the community. What we expected was that the built form would tend toward very typical tower and podium, and that strategy would not be as careful about how it would deal with things like the ecology of the site or other kinds of things that we felt that the community really needed. So our proposal really grew out of analysis that really began with ecology and then made buildings that fit that. So we were free from the pressures of having to deal with a development partner that would default to tower and podium. And that really meant that we were free to do more things with the proposal and think about really the community as a client, as a fictional client, you might say.
And it's interesting that both of these projects, although they're quite different, there's certainly some overlapping themes, but geographically they're very close together. They're sort of in the west end of Toronto. And I guess, you sort of have both alluded to this. I was going to ask what sort of drew you to those locations for your projects. And it sounds like they basically are part of your communities. Is that correct?
Yeah, for us, I mean, we moved further north out of the Parkdale community, but we still feel an attachment to our former community. But it really was also because they were a client. So Parkdale Food Bank, they had a very smart and strategic game plan and started to kind of squirrel away a nest egg and ended up purchasing a building, which is a rare thing for a food bank. Lots of times food banks just go from one leased space to the next and kind of get kicked out as gentrification happens. So when they did purchase the building, we got in touch with them just to see, what kind of services we could offer. So they are clients, and we are still continuing to work with them, and we feel very lucky for that too, because they're great clients, and we feel very lucky to work in that community and give back in that sort of way. But that is our initial kind of touch point, was a professional one.
For us, like I say, it was also in our community. The picture behind me is actually from Swansea in 1910. And what you see in the picture is that the land is not made flat. It really has this kind of undulating condition of reverse ravines and conditions that's like highly planted. And still today, that is the case for Swansea. It's a kind of unusual part in the West End between Hyde Park and then the Humber River and then the lake to the south. So really, it's kind of wrapped by this area of ecologically sensitive lands. And that's really why, too, we felt that it needed a different approach than would be typical.
And David, you mentioned this earlier about the community being a client, and I think that's an interesting point based on both of these projects, because they are sort of a standalone project, but they are serving what seems to be kind of a greater community, as sort of a larger swath of people and folks passing through. And maybe you can both speak to that and how your projects do sort of, they serve the people that live there and work there, and the people that the building serves, but also a broader range of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe I'll speak to that a little bit. I mean, part of this site, it was a Toronto community housing site. So when it gets redeveloped, it will be owned by this public agency. But the thing that we've done is that our public agencies have partnered with private entities over and over again to make things. And those private entities have their own ways they do things. If you're partnering with a kind of market housing developer, then, like I say, they default to tower and podium, which even as they try to manage the community's needs, it's made difficult because there is essentially this conflict for how they begin that process and how they think about that process. So, I would advocate for, if it's really going to be publicly initiated, that it starts with public interest and ask questions about what is the essential portion of this development that belongs to the public or that creates and gives back something to the public, which is not necessarily how a private proponent in a development would think about it. And for good reasons. They are a for-profit business, and it's in part why we probably should keep them at arm's length as we make some of these decisions.
Yep, they have their own agenda. Yep.
Yeah.
How about you, Luke? I mean, a food bank, maybe that's a little more self-explanatory. It's certainly serving a larger community.
Yeah, I think certainly it serves a larger community, and I think just touching on what you said, David, about bringing a private partner into a public thing, and even the word client kind of assumes a certain relationship. As soon as you say client, it becomes a relationship of capitalism and cost, and as architects, we're always part of that cycle. We work on a for-profit for services model, but when we work with Parkdale, ultimately they are a client, but it's a different kind of client, right? Because it's not, Parkdale Community Food Bank doesn't operate to make a profit. They operate to just serve community needs. And I think that was a real kind of beautiful thing working with them, is that the case of profit didn't come up. When we designed this silo for food production, it wasn't so that they could sell food. It was actually so that they could save costs and deliver a better community service to those people. But the community, and even if you're not using the food bank too, I think there are those fringe benefits of if this project was developed. I think in our design we looked for public washrooms because in discussing operational things with Parkdale Food Bank, they said, well, when people are waiting in line for hours to get their groceries, obviously people need to use the washroom, and the closest washroom was the Parkdale library. So, people are queuing and then they're going to the library, they're using the bathroom. So in our design, we thought, the bathroom should be there. It should be a community public washroom. So that has fringe benefits, right? Like even if you're not using the Parkdale Food Bank, but you're using the library, those washrooms aren't as well used. They're vacant more often. So I think there's fringe benefits to even the people who don't directly interact with the food bank. But yeah.
And so when you think about the community kind of as this sort of client, maybe not directly, but indirectly, they're a client. And how do you sort of sort out what they need? How do you design for the community? And maybe, being part of that community certainly helps. You're immersed in it and you know what's going on. But how do we design maybe with the community as well, instead of just saying, hey, this is what you need?
Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I said previously too that we had this conduit with the executive board of Parkdale Food Bank and the people who work there operationally. So they gave us really good insight into the day-to-day operations, and we were able to address those operations kind of directly, like lack of washrooms, people queuing in line. We could address that directly. But well, I mean, ultimately, if this were a real funded project, it would be great to have open houses, to have more kind of, like boots on the ground, so to speak, for us to be engaging directly with the users, right? And taking more of a leadership role in driving those conversations and trying to get as much information from the community as possible about what those needs are. I think the tough part with any sort of program that you come up with is the changing needs, right? It's an evolving, living service, right? And I would love to dream of a future where food banks aren't actually required. So then, what happens then to this building? How does this building continue to serve a public need? And we didn't tackle the end of hunger in our proposal.
It's
It
a
would
big
be
project.
nice.
Yep.
It's a big project, but yeah, it's a question, right? How do these things evolve over time? And we tried to do our best to kind of address it.
How about you, David? Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think like it always begins with analysis where you can understand the very particulars of the site condition. For instance, in our site, we knew that there was a pond that was buried underneath the existing set of buildings. And it's why they had a raised parking garage. So, thinking about that and then reinstating that pond was part of what our thinking was. And then really thinking about the natural heritage. That's also, is going to be important to a community and going forward. So trying to create schemes that would keep that natural heritage in place. And that becomes part of the community. And then really thinking through how the community gathers and what public life starts to look like. And then the buildings kind of follow from that. It's really this idea that where you start. For me too, it's an interesting, like our projects and thinking about them, that when we're talking about libraries and food banks, there's clarity that it is a public project. But public housing has become this thing, this strange mix of public and private. And the private, if you looked at private developments, would you really be able to set them apart from the public developments? They kind of look the same. Are they doing the same things? Especially if we said we're looking just at the built form, apart from programming, we could say that the built form is really resembling the for-profit enterprises. So then, what is really the role of the kind of a public builder when we're looking at this. In the past, it's been that we expect that the public housing relies on charity, essentially, that he create this property. There's a kind of capital cost to making it, but after that, the charity ends and we walk away from it, right? And we leave it to its own devices and the agencies that monitor it. So for our proposal, what we tried to do is, by calling it Swansea Park, was to say that the public stays invested in this community or in this development by adding a public amenity to the development. So it forever becomes something that the larger community or city takes care of by adding a park. So public investments stays inherently a part of what we're thinking about. And so that's why the name change. The idea of calling it a park is fundamentally thinking about funding.
That's interesting. Yeah, it just makes it more accessible for the rest of the city as a place that you're maybe invited to. Oh, it's a park. I can go and use it myself, even if I don't live there.
Imagine if every public housing project included a park, and through the making of more housing, we got more parks, and the parks department grew each time we made public housing. It would be then there'll be a clear distinction, right? We know that we're getting public amenity every single time, and we're increasing public life and adding to the kind of complexity and beauty that can happen in public space.
Yeah. I sorry to jump in, right? I just wanted to say that is a great move, David, to just try and integrate the larger community, because lots of times we see buildings in isolation only. We don't see their connection. And I know with our own project, there is a low-income rental going right up next door to the food bank. And for us, it was about, how does this community extend, even as an architectural or mechanical form? So, we proposed something that would likely never happen in real life, but it was to have you could call it a parasitic architecture, but we called it a symbiotic architecture, because essentially we had this silo full of green growing material, and these are basically lungs, right? So our proposal was to integrate the mechanical system of the low-income house so that they were drawing fresh, oxygenated air through the silo and then dispelling the old stale air. So we wanted to, in the same way you're calling a park a community center, you're drawing people in, we wanted to make this physical connection to our neighbors to really, make that connection more solid, to realize that the people of that housing development relied on the food bank for fresh, it's symbolic, and you don't need to do this sort of thing. But I think if we thought more about how our buildings could interact with other buildings, it just might bring us a little bit closer, right?
Yeah, to follow up on what you're saying, Luke, like, my feeling is that every time that we make architecture and we think about it in isolation, then we're not going to make the best version of what that building must be. That we need to ask questions about its integration. I'm mentioning economic integration and an economic system for how architecture, what it belongs to. Part of what we do inside the city is we look around the world and we ask ourselves, how did they do it over there? How are they managing to, in Singapore, do this amazing sets of public housing projects and other kinds of things that we lament here? And my answer often comes back to that we have an economic systems that limit our thinking and that kind of keep us tied to old models. So the idea too of expanding how architecture relates to different economic systems, but also ones of ecology, and thinking about how we integrate ourselves, the architecture does, to broader ideas of what we're growing inside of the city, I think is important for making architecture that's not just standalone.
I think that's a really interesting conversation, because so often we do think about architecture as these individual buildings. Like, it's a building over here and a building over there. But here we are talking about natural ecosystems and economic integration and food supply chains and all these things. And they really are these projects in particular are kind of part of a larger system. And I don't know, maybe you can both speak to that a little bit about how, should we be doing that more? And maybe you've already answered that a little bit. It's like, should the buildings that we're building try to accomplish more of this integration with other systems throughout the city?
I mean, hopefully, yes. I think there's one thing, I'm not familiar with condominium builds and kind of the mechanisms that they operate under the city, but lots of times we see the public art quotient associated that public art funding. Could it be more of a systems heating and cooling integration with deep geothermal in Great Lakes? Like what else can we do beyond that? What is the mechanism that incentivizes developers and enables architects to come up with creative solutions to integrate buildings into the public sphere? Because I think sometimes the public art feels very tacked on. It doesn't feel integrated into the community. So I think, I'm not trying to be critical of that program because I think it's important, but I'd like to see it expanded and just given more power, empowering architects and designers to create better connections with the city. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what that is, but
to my mind, it begins with our values. Like, when I think of like some of the things we try to, still thinking about housing, but the idea that when we're asking questions about housing, most of the time we're asking the question of how many units are we getting? We've got a housing crisis, and that crisis necessitates that we count numbers of units first. And then my feeling always is, well, after we've counted numbers of units, are we asking questions about other values? Are these going to be socially viable places? Are we asking questions about how they integrate into communities? Do we have the right built form? In fact, are we just defaulting to other built forms? Are we asking questions about mixed use? Like, there's so many things about how we regulate these buildings and how they're made, like that, keep them isolated. I'll give you one regulatory thing, and we don't have to talk about that. The idea that every condo building must provide amenity inside of that building harkens back to a time when these buildings were really thought of as little objects in isolation, and that the building needed to create the amenity for the residents rather than seeing the community as an amenity and thinking about how that building might kind of, make use of the community amenity and connecting it to larger systems. And I think it's how we value things. I think as soon as we decide that there's this kind of hierarchy where the numbers of units will trump all other values, then we're going to find ourselves in a place where we're not finding our buildings integrated into neighborhoods or into the ecology or to other social systems. It'll become this thing where we've checked that box and off we go. And you can see too, it feeds into this idea of a tower. We can say that tower is the best version of things if all we're wanting to do is count numbers of units.
Yeah, it sort of comes down to what we're measuring. Sorry, go ahead, Luke.
No, I was just going to say, and it's a very timely discussion because, we have our Prime Minister coming out with, Build Canada and pushing the number of units, like you're saying, David. But, this is a very turning moment in our history. If we look at the post-war building of World War II and the type of residential units that we came up with, I think we're at a same inflection point. And, I would hate to see it as just simplified to the number of units, but it does feel like that. And, admittedly, I haven't dug into all the policies that the government is pushing through, but it does feel like as architects, we're not part of that conversation. We're not part of a larger conversation about, yes, people need housing, but how does that fit in? How do we tie it in to our communities? How do we tie it in with transit? How does it look even? How does it perform? It becomes very simplified, I think, like what you're saying, David. So,
I still have maybe it's the kind of glass half full part of me that wants to say, when we imagine Toronto, our city, in 20 to 30 years from now, what if I was describing this future city, future Toronto, what would be the kind of key things I would say that differentiates our city from other places? And I'd like to be able to say, oh, well, we have all these mature trees through our city. Our tree canopy is this thing that covers 30% of our kind of urban area. We maintained our rivers through this and kept them as natural banks, and people recreate. Like, one of the joys I still have, because I live close to the Humber River, is when I see people arrive from a subway ride with a paddle and an inflatable kayak, right? And I think that's a nice story to tell about our city. I want to imagine our future city that has these kinds of things going on. And when we ask questions about how nature gets integrated into our city, I'd like to say that we did more than just reduce bird mortality, that we actually increased habitat, and that we thought about where our food comes from, and we created places to grow food inside our cities. And these kinds of are things that we can imagine for ourselves, and they can be possible. They're not so far-fetched that we couldn't already see them. And I think that's an important part of the OAA's ideas competition, that they are counterpoints to what's going on, so that they're not necessarily things that we might have been building, but we could imagine that they could be built. It's not so far-fetched that we can't imagine a city where this happens.
I think you're very right. Like, architecture can be a lot more than a condo that's just maximizing units. It can be very multifunctional. It can do a lot of other things. It can kind of be a tool more than just a space. And that's something I wouldn't mind touching on with both of your projects, because I think they are trying to address that, and they are trying to do more than one thing. We're looking at food security and housing security, but also natural ecosystems and things like that. So could you speak a little bit about how your projects try to be a little more multifunctional, and they're trying to achieve more than just being one thing?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. I think sometimes it's difficult when you have a multifunctional space, when you're designing something like that, because it can come off as maybe vague and not like, when I think about great architectural projects, they're very pointed. They're very like, this is a library, this is a museum. So I think for ours anyways, it was challenging, right? Like, the silo where we're growing food was very simple. The existing building that functions as a food bank, again, very easy. A bathroom, a community restaurant, that stuff. But then we had this rooftop area, and we knew that we wanted to solve a problem of um, basically covered space for people queuing in line for the food bank. That's what we wanted. That's its intent, right? But then it was like, well, can it be beautiful, right? Should it be, so we ended up calling it a conservatory. We started adding plants and nature into it. Um, but it was a concern that, like, is this kind of a vague architectural intervention? And I still think it actually is a little bit, right? So we talked about putting misters in to kind of facilitate growth of, like, trees and plants, but it also worked as like a cooling center in hot times, so people are up there. And we designed these aerogel curtains that could fold in the winter to enclose the space to kind of keep it heated, and reusing the waste heat from the freezers and fridges from the food bank, the rooftop units. So yeah, the multifunctional part, yeah, was difficult. I feel like it maybe lost a bit of its true form, but I'm happy with the way it turned out and it looked. But those spaces are difficult to design. Just speaking from a design perspective, but I do think it would be beneficial to that community, right? I think that space would actually might be the most important space for the most amount of people coming through it.
Yeah, provide some flexibility, and sometimes it's tough to draw the line. You're trying to do so much that, yeah, where do you stop? But
Yeah, yeah.
How about you, David? How does your project?
I think that diversity of uses and buildings that are, you know, that speak to lots of different ideas, I think can be valuable to communities because um, Parkdale, I really love, and I think a lot of people love for the diversity of activities that happens on the street. Um, and, uh, and I think that creates kind of vibrant public life. Uh, that there is this kind of unexpectedness at times too that happens in public spaces um, that really can only occur when you have a certain amount of density and mixed uses going on. And I think that's what continues to be an attraction to a city. Like I would say, if we look at the opposite, like the way that we can answer this is by looking at the very opposite end of the spectrum. And you'd say, where there is no diversity of built form and use, where we have suburbs that are featureless, as how I think about it, because they're featureless because they don't have an architecture that stands out or programs that stand out or features within inside of neighborhoods. The land has been made flat. All these kinds of like featureless conditions that has one new condition resembling another, such that you get lost in them because they look so much alike. I think if we looked at it from that point of view and you'd say, well, we want something that is far more diverse and has more use. And then it also allows communities too, where we can then easily walk to things and find more, and you don't have to travel to specific spots that are designed for that use. This is where you go grocery shopping rather than what happens through these established neighborhoods like Parkdale and Swansea, where you find smaller independent participants or to pick up your groceries and other kinds of things. I think it makes for better public life. So, and even if there is some ambiguity around complex projects, I think that's fine. I'd prefer it than the alternative, I guess.
Yeah. I think too, it's hard for architects to let go, to be like, I designed this space to do this. And then the inhabitants, the community might have a totally different idea of what that space is, right? And as architects, you try your best and you have a vision. But ultimately, the community is going to use your space the way they want to, right?
Yeah. I'll bring it back to our proposal in this one respect that we had created along the Queensway, this kind of the arterial street that serves our site, that we imagined a large public porch that created a microclimate that then could be the infrastructure for lots of different kinds of uses. Because we were thinking about what happens there as a market, or what happens there as students in the neighborhood coming to a place where they could learn about ecology. And there could be any number of things, but really it was the infrastructure to allow all kinds of uses. And that infrastructure really was like providing some power, providing a microclimate, creating shelter that was semi-enclosed that allowed for more things to happen. And I think, that way of behaving is, there's some aspect of each project that's public that should allow that to happen. And then we start to see how, and then we can start to react to how it evolves. And then there's maybe another minor intervention. I don't think that, what I love about landscapes and that kind of approach to things, that when it's made and it's done, it's not done. Plants are still growing, the trees are still growing, they're evolving. I think the mistake we might make in architecture is thinking that it's built and it's done and then we move on, rather than this thing that evolves programmatically or even spatially as it gets adjusted. So I think that's an important lesson to come out of ecological thinking.
And you both mentioned public space and creating a little bit of space for the public and these, some room for these interactions, these random interactions to happen. And this project or this challenge was called Reshaping Communities. And I just want to touch on the importance of public space and how maybe that actually creates community instead of just reshaping it. It's like you're creating a space for community to kind of grow. Does that make sense in terms of your projects? You're not just helping an existing community, you're kind of evolving it, and you're creating a space where people can bump into each other and form those relationships and have those little random conversations on the street, or in your project, wherever it may be. Any thoughts on the importance of public space?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it wasn't, it was actually a kind of a directive from Parkdale Food Bank, and that they act as a food bank, but they realize that they are a gathering spot for community. So they asked for kind of a rotating, almost just like a millwork, a built piece inside the space that different organizations could inhabit during food bank operational hours. So sometimes it's Toronto Community Health, sometimes it's legal services. So those people are, they understand that they need this thing. So luckily they told us, right? And we were able to design this. But yeah, can you design for the unexpected? And I mean, no, like, we have this idea of this conservatory being this beautiful thing, and everyone's queuing and waiting for the food bank and enjoying the beautiful trees. Like at night, it might turn into a rave. Like maybe that's what the community wants, right? And that would be super fun too. So I think, yeah, you make these spaces, and I think you just hope that the community likes it and uses it, right? And I think that should be the goal, as opposed to like, contemplative sitting by a tree, or what we show in our renderings, right?
Yeah, for my part, I'd like to think that when we think about the city of Toronto, when I explain it to people who live outside of the city, family who come here to visit and go to a Blue Jays game or something like that, I don't really get a chance to experience the kind of greater part of the city. It really relies on the city isn't just this kind of one large entity. It really is made up of communities and neighborhoods. And then if we're talking about public life, and that public life exists on different scales. The scale of High Park that's intended to be this kind of West End landscape that serves multiple neighborhoods. There still needs to be other scales of public life that exists inside a neighborhood. And Toronto does that in lots of ways. I mean, like a parquet does that, that serves like a street. And then, for our part, we were thinking about what does a West End public space look like that allows for more urban activity? And that's why we created this public porch. So I think, when we're asking questions and we're looking around our city, and we can ask questions about these different scales of public life, and how those, varied scales then speak to one another. And it allows us then to really create a mental map of where things might be missing. Because there are communities really that, it's easy to point, oh, you've got something that's like 2 or 3 kilometers away as your park where your kids might play, or where you might gather with friends. But then it doesn't necessarily, because of its scale or its distance to where you live, it doesn't belong to you in the same way. So there is something about both scale and proximity to public spaces, I think, that are important for how we think about communities.
And Luke, you mentioned the community maybe taking over space and turning it into a rave. And I think that's an interesting point, because some of these projects can be, especially I think the social projects, can be difficult to kind of measure the success. And maybe you disagree, but it's harder than say, oh, we built X number of condo units, and that's easy to measure. We hit our target. But then other things, these sort of more social projects, it can be difficult, I think, to sort of measure the success. But maybe what you mentioned is kind of the measure. Like people are coming in, they're using the space, they're sort of taking it over in their own way. So any thoughts on how we look back after these projects are done and say, oh, this was a great project and people are using it, versus not so great a project? How do we sort of measure that success?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if our project was truly successful, it actually would just be used as a raving space. If we didn't need a food bank, if we didn't need more public washrooms, if we didn't need community outreach, I think we'd be in a great spot, right? So success is a funny thing to try and like quantify with this building. But I mean, taking it in a more immediate context, yeah, success is people finding community in this building. It's people coming to a space that they feel welcome and secure and beautiful. Um, why do you have to queue up outside 2-3 hours to get your groceries? Why can't you be in an enclosed, comfortable space? Like, why can't you linger in that space longer? Because you know that there's a washroom, you know that you might meet someone, you might make these connections with other people. And I think that would be the measure of success I would apply to it is, do community members find connection? Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel safe? And are their needs being met by this building?
Any thoughts, David, on how to measure success on these tricky buildings?
No, I think Luke's got it right. Like it's ultimately it's like it's creating vibrant public spaces. Speaking of raves, my neighbors had told me of like a rave that was happening underneath one of the overpass on the Humber River. And someone had taken it over, and just underneath this, next to bridges overhead, and underneath it is this river and a bank that's not getting used. And someone decided, let's have a rave here. And there were pictures of like purple lights flashing, and I thought, fantastic, fantastic. That's a little used space, and we didn't plan for anything to happen there. And someone's found it and now makes use of it. And then, and I think that's again, part of like what makes cities fantastic, because then these spaces get found and reused, and we continue to evolve that within our city.
Yeah, I like that.
Unexpected
Finding some
ways.
flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot. Is there anything, I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that you want to touch on that we haven't looked into in terms of your projects or discussion in general? Any sort of closing thoughts or remarks? Not to put you on the spot, but
I'm looking at your show notes, like your notes, and coming back to some of it. I think one thing that you had mentioned was this idea of shelter, and could our buildings and spaces be more than shelter, was a thought. And I think for me, part of some of our housing that we've been making has fallen into that category of only being shelter, because they're so far removed. A unit 30 stories into the sky is removed from social connections. You're not meeting people in your corridor. You're not, you're really divorced from the street at that point. Where housing has always been historically this thing that connects communities. You're on a porch, you're in a low rise, even in multi-residential buildings, low-rise multi-residential buildings that still have connections to the other residents and to the neighborhoods, and then has a chance to influence the street. I think when we're thinking about shelter, it's good to remind ourselves that it has always been more than just shelter. It has been ways that neighborhoods become vibrant or stay vibrant. So we should be mindful of like the kind of built forms we choose that only provide shelter.
yeah, I think buildings can really offer a lot more back to the cities, back to the communities. I totally agree. How about you, Luke? Any final thoughts that you want to double down on?
No, I think we've certainly talked more about raves than I expected in this conversation, but no, I think we've touched on a lot of important points. I think ultimately I would love both of these projects to be built and funded and kind of free of any private intersection. I think it would be hard to argue with a member of the public when you propose these projects to say, do you want more green space? Do you want a food bank that generates its own food? Do you want washrooms, more public washrooms? And I think it's too bad that these things can't be more forefront within the city. I'd love to see more of these things being built because, yeah, like I said, I don't think anyone would say no to either of these projects.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree. More parks, more washrooms, more community space, all that stuff. No one's going to say no. So totally agree. I definitely encourage those people listening to check out the OAA website, search for the 2025 Shift Challenge. You'll find both these projects there. You can sort of dig into them in a little more detail, and you can see some great images and some visualizations there that really showcase these projects as well. And thanks to both of you for joining. You can visit the oaa.on.ca. That's oaa.on.ca to check those out. And thanks to those listening as well, or those watching along on the OAA's YouTube channel. If you're enjoying Architecturally Speaking, you can leave us a quick review, share it with your friends or a colleague. This will help us create more episodes in the future. If you'd like to learn more about architecture in your own community, I mentioned the website, so you can search for the Ontario Association of Architects. There's plenty of information and resources there for architects and the general public alike. So that will do it for today. Until next time, I'm your host, Ryan Schwartz, and this has been Architecturally Speaking. Thanks again to our guests, and we will see you next time.